It was one of those days where even the smallest thing felt like too much. My phone buzzed on the nightstand, unanswered texts piling up like I owed the world something. The fight with Nick earlier that morning had left me raw, words sharp enough to cut still echoing in my head. I had retreated to my apartment, a glass of wine in hand, and was about to succumb to Netflix's numbing comfort when I remembered the message sitting in my inbox. It had been there for weeks, a casual cryptic invite from a woman I barely knew, someone I'd met at a networking event. I hadn't even planned on responding, but that night, something about it felt different. Join us for a night of freedom, exploration, and connection. No expectations. Just a chance to rediscover yourself. I didn't overthink it. I replied with a simple yes, the weight of the decision not hitting me until much later. Saturday evening arrived, and I was more anxious than I'd ever admit. I stood in front of my closet, fingers brushing over hangers, debating whether to play it safe or go bold. In the end, I chose the black dress. Sleek, daring but not too loud. An outfit that whispered confidence even if I didn't feel it. The address led me to a quiet, gated property on the edge of town. Rows of hedges framed a long driveway, flickering lanterns casting soft light over the path. My palms were slick against the steering wheel, but I told myself to breathe. Just one night, I whispered. You're not doing anything wrong. The house was understated but elegant, its warm glow spilling onto the manicured lawn. As I stepped inside, the hum of low conversation wrapped around me. A host in a tailored suit greeted me. His smile practiced and inviting. First time, he asked, as if he already knew. I nodded, managing a nervous laugh. Is it that obvious? Not at all, he said smoothly. Enjoy yourself tonight. Just follow the vibe. And with that, he handed me a glass of champagne and disappeared into the crowd. The atmosphere was surprisingly casual. Groups of people gathered in clusters, their voices low and intimate. A waitress glided by with a tray of drinks, her expression serene. I wandered through the living room, pretending to admire the art on the walls while stealing glances at the guests. A woman in emerald green caught my eye. She moved with a kind of self-assured grace that made me envious. She must have noticed because she sauntered over, a mischievous smile curving her lips. Breathe, she said, placing another glass of champagne in my hand. Her voice was warm, soothing. You'll enjoy yourself more if you let go. Thanks, I said, trying to sound casual, though my heart felt like it might leap out of my chest. She didn't linger long, her perfume a delicate trace in the air as she floated away. At some point, I found myself seated on a sprawling leather couch, its cushions sinking beneath me. Across from me was a man. His posture relaxed but his gaze sharp. Dark eyes held mine for a beat longer than I expected, and something about his quiet confidence made the room feel smaller. What brings you here? He asked, his voice low and steady. Curiosity, I said after a moment. It wasn't the whole truth, but it wasn't a lie either. And you? He smiled, a hint of amusement in his expression. We all start somewhere. His words stayed with me as the night unfolded. The conversations around me softened, touches lingered, and the air grew heavier, more charged. For the first time in months, I wasn't consumed by my thoughts. There was no Nick, no arguments, no expectations. Just this moment, raw and unfiltered. Then came the shift. As I leaned back into the couch, savoring the hum of the evening, a hand brushed mine. The touch was light but deliberate, and I turned to see someone new, a man older than the rest. His eyes were intense, his breath too close. Unease prickled down my spine, and I forced a tight smile before standing abruptly. Excuse me, I murmured, slipping toward the patio. The cool night air hit me like a wave, grounding me. I gripped the railing, staring out into the dark garden, my breath coming fast. What had I been thinking? The champagne buzzed in my veins, but clarity was starting to creep in, unwelcome and sharp. I had come here to escape, but instead I had plunged into something far more complicated. I thought you might need this. The voice startled me. Turning, I saw the man from earlier, the one with the piercing gaze. He held out a glass of water, his expression gentler now. "Don't worry," he said, leaning against the railing beside me. "You're not the first to feel a little overwhelmed." I took the glass, grateful for the moment to compose myself. "Thank you," I said softly. He nodded, his presence steady but unobtrusive. "It's a lot to take in," he said after a pause. "But maybe it's not about fitting in. Maybe it's just about being here." I didn't respond, but his words echoed in my mind long after he left. Maybe he was right. Maybe this wasn't about who I was supposed to be. Maybe it was about discovering something I hadn't even known I was looking for. The room seemed to shift as the night deepened. What had felt like a curious gathering now pulsed with an undeniable rhythm, subtle but insistent. Laughter softened, movements slowed, and the spaces between people dissolved in a way that felt both natural and deliberate. I drifted, glass in hand, absorbing the energy but keeping just enough distance to feel like an observer. The buzz of conversation enveloped me, words blurring into tones of warmth and intrigue. My own thoughts, usually so loud, had fallen silent, replaced by the pull of something I couldn't quite name. And then, there he was again. I spotted him near the edge of the room, leaning casually against a doorway. He wasn't trying to be noticed, but somehow that made him impossible to ignore. His dark hair caught the low light, and his sharp features seemed carved from shadow and warmth. He wasn't the loudest presence in the room, but there was a magnetism about him, something unspoken that made people glance twice. For a moment our eyes met, and I felt a flicker of something unmistakable. Not a challenge exactly, but an invitation. My heart thudded against my ribs as I hesitated, unsure if I wanted to cross the invisible line between us. Before I could overthink it, he moved, weaving through the clusters of people with an easy grace until he was standing just a few steps away. "You look like you're lost in thought," he said, his voice smooth but unassuming. I tilted my head, letting a small smile play on my lips. "Not lost. Just observing." He didn't answer right away, his eyes scanning my face like he was trying to decipher some hidden code. "I get that," he said finally. "Sometimes it's better to watch." His words hung between us, and for the first time all night, I didn't feel the need to fill the silence. Instead, I let myself linger in the weight of the moment, the hum of the room fading into the background. "You don't seem like someone who watches," I said after a while, the words surprising even me. His lips curved into a slow smile, one that hinted at secrets he had no intention of sharing. "Depends on the view." The heat in his gaze was subtle but undeniable, a thread of tension pulling tighter with each passing second. My cheeks flushed, but I refused to look away. There was something thrilling about holding his stare, as though I was balancing on the edge of something I couldn't quite see. Before I could respond, the mood in the room shifted again, this time more noticeably. The music, once soft and unobtrusive, took on a deeper rhythm, the bass vibrating through the floor. Lights dimmed further, and the low murmur of conversation dissolved into a quieter intimacy. People moved closer, their bodies brushing in ways that felt more deliberate now. He extended his hand, the gesture unspoken but clear. "Come with me." For a moment I hesitated, the gravity of the night pressing against my chest. But there was something in his gaze, a quiet confidence that made it impossible to say no. I placed my hand in his, the warmth of his touch steadying my nerves as he led me toward a quieter corner of the house. We found a space near a bay window, where the soft glow of the moonlight cut through the shadows. The sounds of the party were muted here, distant enough to feel like they belonged to another world. He let go of my hand, his proximity close enough to send a shiver down my spine. "Better?" he asked, his voice low. I nodded, leaning slightly against the cool glass behind me. "It's quieter. Sometimes quiet's what you need," he said, his gaze never leaving mine. For a moment I felt exposed, like he could see straight through the layers I had wrapped around myself. But instead of shrinking under his scrutiny, I felt a strange sense of relief. It was rare to meet someone who didn't need words to fill the spaces between moments, someone who didn't demand explanations. The conversation between us was sparse, punctuated by stretches of silence that felt more like understanding than discomfort. He asked me nothing about my past, about why I was here or what I was looking for, and I found myself grateful for the absence of questions. Instead, we stood there, the weight of the evening settling over us like a thick, velvet curtain. My mind, so used to racing through every possible outcome, was blissfully still. For the first time in months, I felt like I didn't have to define who I was. Could just be. When he finally spoke again, his voice was softer, almost hesitant. "You don't seem like someone who's used to standing still." His words struck a chord I wasn't expecting. I smiled faintly, letting the glass of champagne dangle loosely in my fingers. "Maybe that's why I'm here." "Maybe," he said, his tone thoughtful. "Or maybe you're here because you're ready to stop running." The weight of his words settled in my chest, the truth of them sharp but undeniable. I wasn't sure how he saw so much, but I wasn't ready to unpack it. Not here, not now. Instead, I tilted my head, my smile turning playful. "And you?" I asked, arching an eyebrow. "Are you running from something?" He chuckled softly, the sound low and warm. "Not anymore." The night stretched on, and though the room behind us pulsed with energy, our little corner felt like a world apart. Time blurred, the edges of the moment softening until all that was left was the quiet rhythm of his presence and the sound of my own breathing. The air in the house grew heavier, a quiet tension weaving through the room like a current. Shadows flickered against the walls as the dim lighting seemed to bend with the mood. Around me, the party shifted. Laughter turned softer, movements more deliberate, and voices dropped to murmurs only meant for the space between two people. I could feel the pulse of the night in my chest, a rhythm that had little to do with the music. My body hummed with a mix of anticipation and curiosity, a silent dare I wasn't sure I was ready to answer. He hadn't left my side, though he gave me space, just enough to let me breathe but close enough to tether me to the moment. His presence was grounding, his gaze steady, like he was reading the language of my unease and somehow translating it into something lighter. "You're thinking too much," he said, the corner of his mouth tilting into a knowing smile. "I'm trying to figure out how I feel about this," I admitted, gesturing vaguely to the room around us. He tilted his head, studying me. "And how do you feel?" I hesitated, trying to find the words. "It's different," I said finally. "Not what I expected." "That's not a bad thing." His voice was calm, low, but there was a quiet intensity in it that made me shiver. We moved through the room like threads in a tapestry, weaving in and out of the crowd. The groups around us seemed to blur together, people leaning in close, whispers passing between them, hands brushing in ways that felt more intimate than accidental. I caught glimpses of playful glances exchanged across the space, bodies leaning closer together, the energy in the air buzzing like static electricity. A couple on a chaise caught my attention. They were draped in soft shadows, their laughter warm and intimate as they whispered to one another. There was no mistaking the intent in their touches, the way their hands moved with a fluid ease that spoke of familiarity and trust. I couldn't look away, not because it felt voyeuristic but because it was beautiful in a way I hadn't expected. Soft, open, honest. "Comfortable yet?" he asked, his voice breaking into my thoughts. I met his gaze, my lips curving into a small, wry smile. "Getting there." We found ourselves in another room, quieter than the last but still humming with that same undercurrent of connection. A sprawling sectional couch dominated the space, its cushions soft and inviting. The air was warm, tinged with the faint scent of candles and something unidentifiable but heady. Around us, people sat in clusters, their postures relaxed but intimate, conversations unfolding in low, easy tones. He sat beside me, close enough that I could feel the heat radiating from his body, but not so close that it felt overbearing. His presence was deliberate, his movements measured, and I found myself leaning slightly toward him without realizing it. "Why are you really here?" he asked, his voice soft, almost a whisper. I exhaled slowly, the question catching me off guard. Because I needed something different, I said honestly. Because I wanted to feel something. And are you? His gaze locked onto mine, the intensity in his eyes making my breath hitch. I swallowed, my throat suddenly dry. Yes, I said quietly, the word carrying more weight than I intended. The room seemed to fade away, the background noise of laughter and whispers becoming a soft hum at the edge of my awareness. His hand brushed against mine. Not an accident, but not a demand either, just a gentle, deliberate touch that sent a spark up my arm. My breath caught as his fingers lingered, the weight of the moment pressing against my skin. He leaned in slightly, close enough that I could feel the warmth of his breath against my ear. You don't have to do anything you don't want to, he said, his tone reassuring, his words laced with unspoken understanding. The simplicity of his statement settled over me like a balm. There was no pressure, no expectation, just an open door waiting for me to decide if I wanted to step through. And for the first time that night I felt myself relax. The people around us moved in ways that mirrored the growing intimacy of the night. A couple across the room leaned into one another, their movements slow and deliberate, their connection palpable even from a distance. Another group nearby shared quiet laughter, their touches light but purposeful, their boundaries blurred by the unspoken language of trust. I couldn't ignore the shift within myself. It wasn't just about the setting or the people, it was the freedom to let go of the weight I carried, the freedom to explore parts of myself I had kept locked away, the freedom to feel, to connect, to just be. He moved closer, his hand now resting lightly against my knee. The gesture was intimate but not intrusive. His touch a silent question that didn't demand an answer. I looked at him, my breath catching as his gaze held mine, steady and unyielding. You're different than I expected, I said softly, the words slipping out before I could stop them. His lips tilted into a small smile. So are you. I didn't know what I had expected when I stepped into that house, but as the night unfolded around me, I realized it didn't matter. What mattered was the sense of discovery, the unraveling of myself in ways I hadn't anticipated. And for the first time in a long time I didn't feel like running. The house was quieter now, the earlier buzz of conversation and laughter replaced by something softer, deeper. It felt like the night itself was holding its breath, waiting to see how it would end. I found myself back in the main room, where the golden glow of the lights seemed warmer now, wrapping around everyone like a velvet ribbon. People had settled into their rhythms, some gathered in small, intimate clusters, others leaning close in corners where the shadows softened the edges of the world. The air was thick with unspoken promises, an unhurried exchange of glances and touches that felt both personal and universal. He was still beside me, a constant presence in the ebb and flow of the night. We had spoken less as the hours passed, but words didn't seem necessary. His hand rested lightly on the back of the couch, his body angled toward mine in a way that felt protective but not possessive. It was an unspoken understanding. We were in this together, wherever it might lead. Are you still thinking? He asked, breaking the silence. His voice was low, warm, cutting through the quiet like a soft hum. Always, I admitted, my lips curving into a faint smile. He shook his head, his gaze steady. You don't have to. Not here. And just like that, he leaned closer, the space between us dissolving. It wasn't hurried or desperate, just a slow, deliberate movement, the kind that felt more like a conversation than a decision. His hand brushed against mine, his touch firm but tentative, as though he was asking a silent question. I didn't answer with words. I didn't need to. The room seemed to fade around us as he reached for my face, his fingers brushing my cheek with a gentleness that made my chest tighten. His touch wasn't possessive or demanding. It was quiet, steady, a reminder that I was still in control. My breath hitched as his thumb grazed my jaw, and for a moment, all I could hear was the soft pounding of my own heartbeat. I felt the warmth of his breath against my skin before his lips met mine, a slow, deliberate connection that sent a shiver down my spine. It wasn't rushed or urgent, but it carried a kind of intensity that made the world fall away. Every nerve in my body seemed to hum with electricity, the simple act of being touched feeling like the most profound thing in the world. Around us, the party continued, the energy of the room wrapping around us like a cocoon. I could hear the faint murmurs of voices, the occasional burst of laughter, but it all felt far away, like a dream I was only half awake for. His hand slid down to rest lightly against my waist, the weight of it grounding me in the moment, reminding me to stay present. I wasn't thinking about the hours before or the hours ahead. I wasn't worried about who I was or who I was supposed to be. For the first time in what felt like forever, I wasn't worried at all. When the moment finally broke, it wasn't with regret or hesitation. He leaned back slightly, his gaze searching mine as though he was checking for something unspoken. "You okay?" he asked, his voice barely above a whisper. I nodded, my lips curving into a small, genuine smile. "More than okay." He smiled in return, his fingers brushing against mine one last time before he let go. The rest of the night passed in a blur. I didn't stay much longer. Something in me felt like it was time to leave, to let the night end on its own terms. As I stepped outside, the cool air hit me like a balm, sharp and clean against my flushed skin. The garden stretched before me, a quiet maze of shadows and soft light. I took a moment to stand beneath the sky, the stars glittering like tiny promises in the darkness. My mind was quiet for the first time in years, the weight I had carried for so long feeling lighter somehow. The memory of his touch lingered on my skin, not as a burden or a question but as a reminder of something I had almost forgotten. The power of connection, of being seen and wanted for exactly who I was. I climbed into my car and drove home, the silence of the road wrapping around me like a blanket. I didn't know what the future held, but for the first time I wasn't afraid of it. Whatever came next, I knew I'd face it with a little more clarity, a little more courage, and maybe, just maybe, a little less fear of letting go.